Today we're continuing the series called The Way of Jesus. The Way of Jesus. So this is the second message in this series, and if you've missed the first one, you can jump onto YouTube and catch up on what Judy shared with us last week. But today I want to share a topic with you that may not be the topic that you want to hear today, but I believe it is a topic that we all need to hear and lean into. And it's the topic of the cycles of suffering and renewal. The cycles of suffering and renewal. And the reason why I want to speak about that is because so often when people talk about following Jesus, they talk about it in a certain way. People talk about following Jesus as being the best decision you'll ever make and the most exciting decision that you'll ever make. And often that's as far as we go with that conversation. We stop there. But the thing is, all of that is completely true. But if we don't have the whole picture, we're going to get some surprises along the way as we're following Jesus. You see, it is the best decision that I have ever made. It has been the most exciting aspect of my life. But following Jesus also involves pain and suffering and struggle. And so I want to speak to you about that today, because if we don't talk about this, at some point in your journey with Jesus, you're going to run into struggle. You're going to run into something difficult. And you'll probably turn to Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, I didn't sign up for this, right? When I signed up to follow you, I thought everything was going to be Hakuna Matata, no worries. And so I want to help you to understand what it actually looks like to follow Jesus and to sign up for following him. You know, it's a bit like a contract. You know, has everyone ever, you get a brand new mobile phone and you're keen on your new phone and they give you like a 20-page document with all the terms and conditions and you have to sign to say, I agree. And you're like, oh, I don't want to read that, I just want the phone. So I sign to say that I've agreed. And sometimes we do that in our faith, right? Like we want Jesus' help, we want the forgiveness of our sins, we want eternal life, and we sign it and we agree and we're like, yes, I'm going to follow you, but we don't fully know what it involves, even though it's there right there in the pages of the Bible. But the thing is, when we start talking about suffering, I want you to understand, is that with Jesus, suffering is never the end destination. All right? With Jesus, suffering is never the end destination. If I was to quote to you a message that my wife shared with us when we did a series on Psalm 23, and there's that line about, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And she pointed out, and I've never forgotten this, that Jesus doesn't lead us to the valley, he actually leads us through the valley, right? He doesn't lead us there and drop us off in a place of suffering. He actually leads us through it, beyond to something else. With Jesus, suffering is never the destination. And as we start to understand this can be profoundly helpful for all of us. Because in the midst of our pain and our struggles, there can be a reassurance to know that God has plans beyond our present struggles. That God has a plan for us, something that he's leading us towards beyond what we go through here in this life. So it can give us reassurance to know this. But it can also give us hope. Hope that Jesus is in the business of transforming those graves into gardens that we just sung about. That he actually brings new life from places in our life where it feels like there is struggle or sometimes even death. And so to speak about this, we're going to read a Bible passage, and I'm going to bring up a QR code for you because I would love everyone to have this passage open in front of you this morning. So if you've got your physical Bible, you can open up to Matthew 16. We're going to read from that together. And if you don't have a Bible, you can scan the QR code. It'll bring up the Bible passage on your phone, because we're going to engage with this, but I want you to see this for yourself and to read what Jesus says about what it looks like to follow after him. And so as you get that out, let me just speak to a couple of things. I think this passage is going to help us have clarity on what to expect when we go to follow Jesus. So what does it look like to follow Jesus? And in this passage, you're going to see a cycle and pattern of how God actually works in and through suffering to a greater outcome on the other side. But what you won't see in this passage, what you won't see is a way to bypass pain and struggle, but what you will see is what Jesus can do through the pain and struggle that we go through. Now, some context for this passage. Just before the story that I'm going to read to you today, Peter makes this important confession. Jesus says, they're at Caesarea Philippi and says, "Who do other people say that I am?" And the disciples rattle off some answers. And then he says to Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah." And it's straight off the back of this story that we're going to read today, where his disciples have just acknowledged who Jesus is. And now Jesus is going to explain to them what it means for him to be the Messiah and what he is about to do on their behalf. So let's read this together. We'll start with Matthew 16, and we'll just start with verse 21 and read that together. So here it is. "So from then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, and that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but on the third day he would be raised from the dead." We'll just stop there. Just stop with this one verse. So off the back of understanding who Jesus was as the Messiah, he now speaks to what he is about to do for them and by extension for each and every one of us. And he lays out a bit of a process that he's about to go through. And on this next slide now, I want to show you this process in terms of a cycle. And I'm going to read now this passage through the lens of what Jesus just spoke about here. And so the first thing we see is that Jesus is about to engage in surrendering and obedience to the will of the Father. In the passage, Jesus says it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem. Now, already in this story, before this point, there was trouble brewing. And so it would have been no surprise to Jesus or his disciples that if they went to Jerusalem, that they were walking into a fight. They were walking into danger. And so Jesus isn't going to Jerusalem because he thinks it's a great holiday destination. He's going there in obedience to the Father's plan. He knows that God has called him to go to Jerusalem. And so his plan, his process, he starts with surrender and obedience to the Father's will for his life. He says, "I'm going to go to Jerusalem." But he knows that when he gets there, there will be suffering. Jesus says that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, leading priests, the teachers of the religious law. Now note that when he goes to Jerusalem, it's not God inflicting suffering. There are people that are going to bring suffering against him. Jesus knows what waits for him, and yet he surrenders and is obedient, leaning in towards that place of suffering. Jesus then says that when that happens, he would be killed. There would be a death for Jesus. But there is still another part in this process. The part is resurrection. Jesus says on the third day, he would be raised from the dead. This is the part in this little paragraph that we often skip out. We miss that Jesus is plainly saying to his disciples, "I will suffer, I will die, but I will raise again." Now, for Jesus' disciples, he didn't just tell them this once, right? This is going to be confusing for them. And this is actually the first of 4 times in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus tells them what's about to happen. So he doesn't just leave this to them, guessing and figuring it out. 4 times he tells them that he has to go, he has to suffer, he has to die, but he will rise again. And yet when it takes place, it still catches them all by surprise. It catches them by surprise. And so Jesus tells the disciples what's about to happen. What do you think the disciples think about what Jesus has to say? Do you think they like this idea? Do you think they like where Jesus is leading them? The answer is no. If we read the next verse, verse 22, it says this, "But Peter took Jesus aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. 'Heaven forbid, Lord,' he said, 'this will never happen to you.' And Jesus turned to Peter and said, 'Get away from me, Satan. You are a dangerous trap to me.' And listen to this. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's." Let's just stop there. So I think Peter speaks on behalf of the disciples when he says, we don't like this plan. But can you imagine the audacity of Peter? He's the disciple and he pulls his master, his teacher aside and reprimands him and says, "Hey, Jesus, That's not going to be what happens here, right? Let me tell you what I think should happen from here. Peter's audacity. But you see, the thing is, what Jesus was proposing to them was not what they had signed up for, right? When these disciples had signed up to follow the Messiah, they did so with their own expectations and assumptions about what it would look like to follow Jesus. They thought by being with the Messiah that we will always be the winners, we will evict the Romans, we'll restore the nation of Israel, we'll show the world how to worship Yahweh. Like they've got all these ideas that they bring with them to following Jesus. And you know what? They weren't wrong, but they were misunderstood the way that God desired to achieve his plans and what that would look like in reality, right? They came and they signed up with their own expectations, but God had something different in mind. And so they couldn't fathom how a suffering and a dying Messiah could possibly be a part of God's plans or his purposes for restoring them at that time. Now, we're not so different to the disciples, are we? When we walk through dark valleys, when we walk through difficult times, I know how quickly I am to reprimand God and say, God, we're not going to have any of this, right? This is not what I signed up for. I thought that my life would be, and I insert and fill the blank. I know how many times in my own life it's like I have reprimanded God the way that Peter does here. I wonder, are we any different in the way that we respond to Jesus? But Jesus then responds to Peter with a pretty powerful statement. He says, you're a dangerous trap to me. And he says, you are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's point of view. And I wonder how often do we also do the same in this regard? When we're struggling, when we're going through things that we didn't expect, when there is pain in the midst of the pathways of life, how often are we seeing it from our human perspective and not actually seeing it from God's vantage point? I mean, that's the natural response, right? We struggle to see how God could make something good from the struggles that we are going through. And so in that way, we're just like the disciples in this story. But you see, where we see death, Jesus sees life. Where we see an end, Jesus sees a beginning. Where we are tempted to despair, Jesus sees hope and a different outcome. You see, when we're with Jesus, suffering is never the destination. There is always something on the other side. And so we see here for Jesus what he is about to go through. He's going to surrender and be obedient. He's going to move towards suffering. There will be a death for him, but on the other side of that, there is resurrection and new life. Now I wonder, is that cycle or process just for Jesus? Or is that cycle and process for us as well? Well, let's see what Jesus has to say. In verse 24, he continues. And so then Jesus said to his disciples, so now he speaks to them, and now he speaks to us. And this is what he says. He says, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? And so now Jesus speaks to us as his followers. And he says, I'm going to tell you what's involved if you choose to follow after me. And then he proceeds to give these answers. And once again, I want to bring up that same image for you of this cycle. And I want to show you this cycle as I now read what he says to us in that passage that I've just shared to you, so you can see the process, see what he's inviting us into. It starts with surrender and obedience. He says, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. To give up your own way. Following Jesus actually requires us to lay down our own will, to lay down our own plans, to lay down the things that we thought our life was going to be all about and completely surrender it and say, actually, Jesus, I invite you to lead me. To be a follower of Jesus always starts with surrender and obedience. But we can see that it also involves suffering. Jesus says, if you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way. And then he says, you must take up your cross and follow me. Now you need to understand, at the time that Jesus spoke these words, he hadn't been crucified yet. But that metaphor of taking up your cross was well understood by the people at that time. They knew that crucifixion, the sign of taking up your cross, was a sign of suffering and execution. Because people who were crucified were typically they were crucified because they had chosen a way of life or a belief or to rebel against Rome. They had chosen something that they refused to let go of. And so to say to take up your cross was an invitation to his disciples to take up a way that would likely include suffering, perhaps even suffering to the point of death. And so Jesus doesn't mix his words here. He doesn't undershoot this. He says them, it involves taking up your cross to follow me. It's no wonder when Jesus speaks about these things that suddenly the crowds disperse and his followers start to scatter. So he invites us into surrender and obedience, into taking up our cross, a way that may involve suffering. But it also requires death. He says, if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. There is an invitation to a death to self, to give up our lives, to give up who we are for the sake of Christ. We don't like talking about that part because that's painful and it's intense. But Jesus calls us to do this as we follow him, to take up our cross, to follow him, to give up and surrender our life. But it doesn't just stop there. And this is the thing I want you to see, is that it doesn't stop at that point. He doesn't park us at death. He doesn't park us in suffering. There is something that happens beyond that, because he says, if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. You will find it. There will be life for your soul. You see, Jesus' cycle in our life is always focused on resurrection and renewal. And in our lives, this happens in many ways and in many places. It's not just when we lose our physical life, but it is the daily deaths, the daily surrendering, the daily giving up of ourselves to follow Jesus, no matter what that may require. Now, theologians call this the Pascal's mystery. The Pascal's mystery. And let me just read you a quote about this cycle from a man named Ronald Rolheiser. And he says, this cycle is not something that we must undergo just once at the moment of our deaths, when we lose our earthly lives as we know them. It is rather something we must undergo daily in every aspect of our lives. The Paschal mystery is the secret to life. Ultimately, our happiness depends upon properly undergoing it. You see, here we find this mystery, and they call it a mystery because as humans, we don't understand why God would use our suffering and struggles to produce life and resurrection in us. And yet, all through Scripture, we see this cycle, and we see that this is what is involved as we choose to follow after Jesus. And sometimes we see and experience this cycle in this life and on this earth. And sometimes this cycle is never fully complete in this life. And we'll never see the other side of it until that one day, till we step into eternity. But I think for a lot of us, so much of our disillusionment with Christianity and our disillusionment with following Jesus can come because we actually don't want the things that Jesus invites us into. Rather than giving up our own way and taking our cross and following him, we would rather keep our own way, avoid suffering, and have Jesus go the direction that we would like to go. And because of that, we find ourselves sometimes in tension with God. And we go, God, why are you allowing these things to happen? Sometimes our disillusionment can be because we weren't expecting this fine print. We didn't realize that following Jesus was an invitation into suffering and struggle, but also an invitation beyond that, into resurrection and renewal. And so one of the big struggles and problems that we have here is each of us, we resist this cycle. We actually resist this. So I'll show you this next image. You see, we resist this because in all honesty, none of us want to go through struggle and hardship. I'll be the first one to say, I am avoidant of pain. If there is a way in life, two choices, and one is going to be painful and hard, and the other one's going to be a bit easier and fun, I'm going to choose the easy and fun, all right? All of us would choose that. That is our human nature. And so because of that, I find in my life, and I know for many others that I've done ministry with, we resist this. We resist surrendering and being obedient to God because we don't want to walk a way that could involve suffering and struggle. And we resist it because often we don't trust that Jesus may have something on the other side for us. But I just want you to understand this. God does not cause our pain, right? God is not up there plotting and scheming a way to cause pain and hardship in your life. God does not cause our pain, but I tell you this, he certainly does not waste it, right? God does not waste a thing. Romans 8:28 says, God works all things for the good of those who love him and serve him. God doesn't cause us pain, but he's not going to waste it. He can use it to transform us, to transform our circumstances, and to bring new life out of the places that we thought may have been the end of something. And how about I just speak to you a bit about that in my own life? I mean, there are so many ways and stories I could speak to you about the things that I've gone through, but let me just speak to what I'm going through at the moment. You see, you know about my foot. I've had this surgery, and there's been months of pain and issues and recovery involved in this for me. And you know that particularly before my surgery, I had so many people praying in faith for me. I mean, you guys prayed for me right here on this stage. I've had people pray for me in clusters in private, from their home, through text messages, phone calls, laying their hands on my dirty, smelly feet. Like, I've had so many people pray in faith for me. And so many people say to me, Ryan, I don't know that this is God's plan for you. He wants you to have a healed foot. And so they've prayed in faith. And I've grappled with this because God did not heal my foot. He did not heal my foot. And you know what compounds to the pain of that? In the best way and the worst ways. I mean, a week ago, Brooke got up and shared a story that just a week or so ago at our prayer and worship night, she had a dud foot, a hurt, injured foot. And the team prayed for her, and she had tingling in her foot. And God healed her to the point that within a day or two, she did a 12-kilometer hike. And I'm celebrating that miracle, going, see, God can do this. He's done it here in our church. And yet at the same time, man, there's pain. I say, Jesus, why did you heal her? And why didn't you heal me? Because I've missed out on so much. And the pain has been intense. And I've had so many faithful people say to me, Ryan, I don't think this is what God's plan for you is. And yet here I am, having more falls, delaying my recovery, still in pain, knowing that in 12 months I still have another surgery and have to start all over again. And so I've been agonizing with this, going, God, why have you allowed this in my life? Why do you heal others? And why haven't you healed me? But you see, the thing is, in this moment, it's where this cycle has been so helpful for me in my life. Because I know that Jesus brings new life where it seems like there's death and pain and struggle. And so there's been time after time that I have to continually choose to say, Jesus, I trust that there is something on the other side of this. And I trust that you are going to use this struggle to develop something new and different in me. And so, Jesus, if this takes months or years, I have to trust that you are shaping me to be more Christ-like, to develop that patience that I spoke about before. And if that's going to involve pain and hardship in my physical body, then so be it. Because I want more of Jesus in my life. And I can trust that he is doing something beyond the pain, something beyond the struggle. And so knowing about this cycle, knowing that Jesus restores and renews and that this cycle is part of my life, it doesn't make it any easier in the quick getting it done, but it gives me hope and reassurance now in the midst of this, that God is doing a work in my life and perhaps even a work in our church as I go through this. That's just a window into my life. But I wonder where you're at. And I wonder what pain and what struggle and what hardships have you endured? Or are you still enduring and carrying with you? It's where that question around what kinds of bitterness or discontent is still sitting under the surface for you. But I bring you this cycle, I bring you this invitation, not so that you can go, oh no, there's suffering and that's the end, but to actually see that there is always hope with Jesus. The suffering is never the end destination, that there is something on the other side. I want to help reorientate your expectations of following Jesus so that as you follow him, you understand there may be struggle in all different forms. It may come as you grapple with your own sin and brokenness. It may come as you grapple with the way that other people treat you and the things that other people say and do. It may come as a result of your faith as people pick on you or even one day persecute you because of what you believe. It may come because of your physical health and the things that you didn't expect in life. In whatever way it comes, when it does come, I want you to understand this is not a detour from following Jesus. Part of following Jesus means going through this and trusting him with it and trusting what he can do on the other side. It's reorientating. It's giving us reassurance and helping us to have hope. Hope that in the midst of our struggles, that we have a Lord and Savior that has never left our side. And so what I want to do is I want to read to you one final scripture passage. And I want you to start to see this cycle in this passage. The cycle of surrender and obedience, suffering even to the point of death, but resurrection and renewal. This is what the Apostle Paul says about struggles and trials in 2 Corinthians 4. He says, we are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Through suffering, our bodies continue, listen to this, to share in the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies. And he goes on to say this, verse 16, this is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long, yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. So we don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on the things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. Here's the Apostle Paul living out that cycle that we just spoke about. He speaks about the struggles and the trials to the point of death that they go through, and he doesn't run away from them, but he lives a life of surrender and obedience. He goes where God calls him to go, no matter what it might mean for him. He endures the suffering and struggle, the troubles that he talks about in here, to the point of death, that after writing these words, eventually he's martyred for his faith. But he, all the while, looks ahead to what's on the other side. And I love that it says that he fixes his gaze on things that cannot be seen, fixes his gaze on the hope that is ahead. And he speaks about the way that their spirits are being renewed. In the midst of all his struggles, his spirit was being renewed. And you see, this is what Jesus has for each and every one of us. That as we follow him, and as we go through suffering and struggles, he continues to renew our spirits day by day, despite what is coming against us, despite what comes up that we did not plan for. And so you too can fix your eyes and fix your gaze on things that cannot be seen, on the hope of new life that Jesus has for you. That hope is both for in this life and for in the life to come. that you can trust that Jesus will use the things that you are going through for your good, for renewal. And the things that are unfinished in this life will ultimately be finished in the life that is ahead. I love that Levi shared that Revelation passage in communion. He didn't know what I was speaking on today. But that passage is the picture of what our eternity looks like. That one day there is no more suffering, no more pain, no more tears. That one day it'll just be us and God. Jesus has resurrection life for you. He invites you to follow him. And that invitation involves taking up your cross. But it doesn't stop there. It ends in resurrection and renewal. So I wonder, will you trust Jesus? Will you choose to follow him? And will you actually follow the Messiah who suffered on your behalf? You don't follow a Messiah that was immune from suffering. You follow a Jesus who suffered for you so that you could have new life and life through him.